Paul, welcome to the Gravity Commons podcast.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm really glad to be on.
I'm so excited to chat with you about this book. Before we kind of jump into maybe setting the table, giving some context for it, maybe help us understand what was the genesis of this project for you? How did you decide, and why did you want to write it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've always been interested in the law, both as sort of a question of sort of it's a systematic topic. Sort of people ask like, what's the relation of the law to X? But more recently, in the last 7 or 8 or 9 years, I was more interested in the question of particularly the interpretation of the law or the interpretation of Torah, both in sort of the Judaism of Jesus' day and as that interpretation is expressed both in the Gospels and Paul and the wider New Testament. And so, my I've learned a lot through David Moffat's work, and then through his work and other material, he was able to push me to read scholars that at that stage of my education I just really hadn't dug into yet. Scholars like Jacob Milgram and Jonathan Klawans and a few others who were doing just a lot of high quality work in just the law itself or the sacrificial system itself, and then how it was received in subsequent centuries. So that just became interesting to me. You couple that with the fact that in my early days of my master's education, I'd read a lot of like a lot of folks, probably a lot of N.T. Wright, and particularly his Origin of God series. The New Testament and the People of God, and through those books, I was just really impressed upon me how significant, according to Wright, how significant sort of restoration eschatology was in the New Testament and in the Hebrew Bible as well. And so, I'd long had that conviction that restoration eschatology was a meaningful framework by which you could interpret various passages. So restoration eschatology sort of being the pattern of reading that reads Deuteronomy 28 to 30 to sort of tell sort of the the story of Israel, as it were, about how they're going to receive the law and then break it, but then they're going to go into exile. But then after that, they're going to return to God and be restored. And that constitutes sort of Israel still being under that discipline constitutes the plight to which the Gospels depict Jesus and others as sort of the solution, as it were. So I long had that. It wasn't until I sort of coupled these interests, both restoration eschatology and that interpretation of Torah, that I realized, oh, I think I have something here to say that is a little bit different than what's been being said about how the law is being employed or interpreted by Jesus in this context of restoration eschatology.
Yeah, thank you. And you gave a little indication of where we're headed when you talked about the problem being enduring exile. Um, and I'd love for you to set the table, maybe the context into which your restorationist eschatology proposal is sort of being put into, because for many of us, whether it was explicit or implied, the problem was the law
Sure.
itself, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's right.
And so how did we get to a place where, as Protestants, in the 21st century, we either assume or believe that the law is something, well, that Jesus comes to save us from? And maybe just walk us through a little bit, if you want to throw out E.P. Sanders, and you already mentioned Tom Wright, like how they seek to put it together, and then how yours is a little distinct.
So that's another really good question. Thanks, Matt. The I won't speak to how it's sort of its genealogy in academic scholarship. I can say about my own interaction with it, just growing up in the church, where the distinction I'd heard between, say, Jesus and his peers, or Paul and their peers, was a distinction that was drawn largely in terms of a pattern of religion. Judaism does religion this way and has a soteriology, sort of a an expectation that you have to, you know, earn your place in heaven or earn your place in God's kingdom, but that with the arrival of Jesus and the Spirit and Paul's ministry, Paul and Jesus learned that no, after all, that's a wrong way of thinking. That pattern of religion is wrong. Rather, we need to come to a new understanding that actually salvation is a gift and it's received through grace, etc. And so, growing up with that sort of description of Jesus in the Gospels or Paul in his letters, it makes it easy to interpret the law then as basically the problem because the law fits in on that earn your salvation side of the pattern of religions thing. And so law stood for doing things, working, and so that then grace, spirit, faith, all these other positive words, right? We're on the other side of the ledger, and instead realize that okay, this is it's you have to learn now that salvation is actually just something that you receive through grace. Um, that then I think leads to, um, I think just then that just it putting it that way doesn't even permit the kind of question one could ask or that I tried to talk about in this book. Like the whole question of so how does Jesus to interpret the law is like sort of like, well, who cares? It's something that's gone away with now, right? Like who cares how he interprets it because that's working with the wrong pattern of religion in the first place. And particularly a pattern of religion that we know that Romans and Galatians falsifies, right? And so what has often happened in at least sorry, I should say what often happened in my own upbringing was a certain pattern of reading of Paul um, that was then used as a lens by which to interpret also the Gospels, such that what Paul was opposing in, say, Galatians was A, it must have been sort of works righteousness. That must have been what he was opposing. Well, we know that sort of Jesus and Paul must be on the same page. And so, right, when Jesus is sort of opposing the Pharisees, that also must be what he's opposing, right? So a certain kind of interpretation of Paul was then used to retroject what's going on in the Gospels. And I did say that I wouldn't describe that in terms of academic scholarship because I think academic scholarship is has been more refined than that. But it it is there. I mean, you can obviously see it in certain kind of old perspective scholars. That of course nuance it way more than that or differently than that. But it's also in so for example, I out of curiosity, I checked Calvin's commentary on Matthew 19, the passage I open with, and that is how he takes it. He takes sort of the man comes to ask Jesus, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus answers, "Keep the commandments." And Calvin, says, understandably, like he doesn't want to depict Jesus as having lied to the guys. So he says, of course that was the right answer, right? But we know that from Romans 3 that that's actually not really the right answer. And so it becomes this. However, that kind of interpretation was received to mean that okay, Jesus gave the impossible standard so that then you could later learn the need for grace and faith instead, right? And so once you've got sort of that 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 pattern of reading of either Paul or Jesus, whichever direction of dependence you apply to it, the law itself just kind of becomes the problem to be overcome because the law stands in for works righteousness. And to be very clear, I'll move to what I think is a better one. To be very clear, I also think salvation is by grace and all these things. My point is to say that I'm trying to show that God's grace that you receive is not sort of contrary to the Torah itself, so that you can actually couple Torah and grace in a way that some readers have been uncomfortable doing. So I also agree that you receive salvation, etc. It's more just that my point is that you don't have to throw the Torah out to get there. So then the reason why I think the restoration eschatology thing differs from that is because I'm not saying that there's a pattern of religions issue that, okay, the Pharisees were teaching works righteousness and Jesus teaching something else. I'm saying that like, look, actually a lot of Jews, a lot of Jewish texts at least, agreed that there was a pre-existing plight, the enduring exile, whatever, and that the Gospels are depicting Jesus as the solution to that plight, not to the solution of legalism or works righteousness or to the law itself. He's the solution to the national plight of exile and the enduring discipline, so that then you're able to look at the distinction between, say, Jesus and the Pharisees, not on the axis of, well, Pharisees are works righteous and Jesus isn't, but more on the axis of he knows that he's the herald of the restoration and they don't agree with that claim. And so consequently, they're also going to disagree with some of his interpretation of Torah that's downstream of his conviction that he's the herald of the restoration.
Okay, we are in the deep end, friends. Here we are. We're in the deep end. Um, I'm gonna ask you to maybe to double click and help people like me to kind of like really hash this out a little bit. But
Okay, good.
one of the implications here is that you contend that Jesus isn't advocating for breaking the law, but rather he's offering his understanding of how to keep the law, right?
That's right. Yes, yes.
So how does this understanding change the way that we interpret stories, like you mentioned, like Matthew 19, the rich young ruler, or
Uh-huh.
even in the Sermon on the Mount, like you've heard it said, but
Yes,
I
yeah.
say this. Can you like kind of pick one of those and kind of double click on that for us?
Yes, thanks. Really good question. Yeah. Okay, let's do the Matthew 5 one.
Okay.
He famously, right, this it's Matthew 5:21 to 48, famously labeled in a lot of understandings, the antitheses, right? So the notion that law says this, but I say this, so that they're creating an antithesis between what the law says and what Jesus says. It's easy with that label, the antitheses, but even without that label, just if you read the syntax and it says, you have heard it said X, but I say ABC. It's easy to hear that and think, oh, Jesus is um, countering the law. The law says X, but I'm saying something else that isn't Torah or isn't Torah informed or something like that. Um, or is okay, it's kind of Torah informed, but really is Jesus sort of going after the interior disposition where the law only regulated your external action, right? So there's a lot of different ways that Matthew 5 has been taken. One is sort of just he's countering law. One is he's um giving his own instruction that isn't Torah informed. And one is the supposition that, okay, the Torah just regulates your external actions, and that's kind of deficient. And so Jesus is more interested in sort of regulating a person, or like, speaking to the person's heart. So I'll speak to that last one first. I do think Jesus is speaking to interior dispositions and to the heart. That would seems to be quite clear. My point would be to emphasize that the law does that, so that when Jesus is doing that, he's actually just expositing what the law itself is teaching, right? Um, and that's an important framework, because now it's not Jesus versus law; it's Jesus expositing actually precisely what the law says vis-a-vis a person's heart or interior. The most famous one, obviously, right? Hear, O Israel, right? Love the Lord your God with all your, you know, with all your heart, right? Like with all your,
Right.
and all the things that are mentioned are like your interior dispositions, right? Your heart, soul, and mind, right? Like these are all like interior dispositions by which you're supposed to express your love for a God, right? It's not love the Lord your God with all these reductively, observable external actions, right? Those will obviously come out, but it's like those are expressions of where your heart posture. Also, I mean, like famously, like the funniest one to me is right. It's in the Ten Commandments, right? Do not covet.
Mhm.
Do not covet is an interior disposition, right? It's and even the word covet is actually just the word. When Jesus says it, for some reason we translate it as lust.
Mhm.
um and so when Jesus says, for example, right, you've heard it say don't commit adultery, but I don't even say, I say don't even look after a woman with lust, lust. Well, that word lust, or the word that's translated lust, is just the Greek word
Mhm.
that is translated covet from the Ten Commandments. So my point is that's I picked this particular example now to branch to my next point, which is that what I think actually Jesus is doing in the so-called antitheses is not sort of juxtaposing what law says over against what he says, that somehow isn't lawish. Rather, he's interpreting one command, the command he quotes, and correlating it with other known commandments and saying how they mesh with one another and inform how one keeps the other. So, for example, again, take the lust one. Lust, again, you have to remember, is just the word covet. So all of a sudden you have Jesus saying, hey, the law says don't commit adultery, and the law also says don't covet. So once you've violated do not covet, you've actually already violated do not commit adultery in your heart.
Mhm.
And so it's one commandment being informed by another. Same actually with let's pick another one. Vows, right? You've heard it said, don't make false vows and keep your vows, right? And I say, don't even vow at all, right? Well, that one again sounds like, right? Okay, well, the law says this, and Jesus saying not this, right? Except the law also says, right? If you don't vow, that's fine, right? Because like not vowing is actually because vows are an optional thing. They're not a you don't have vows are not prescribed. They're not required. Vows are a permissible optional thing. And another text in the Torah itself says, if you don't vow, it's no sin, right? But if you do vow, you make sure you pay it. Like make sure you keep that vow. But if you don't vow, that's fine. And then subsequent texts from Ecclesiastes to Philo, Josephus, the Essenes, Sirach, Mishnah, Talmud, like literally almost every extant Jewish source is like, yeah, it's just better not to vow. I mean, yeah, for sure. If you make a vow, keep it, but just don't make vows. And in fact, like literally, like Josephus, I think it's Josephus recording the Essenes and also Philo in his own right, saying, look, if you're the kind of person who vows, you already kind of sound like someone who's not trustworthy. In fact, Philo's exact words are, or I should say exact words. Now I'm going to paraphrase them, but he says, let your vow, let your word be as secure as an oath.
Right.
And I mean, it just sounds a lot like what Jesus says. Like, Jesus. Yeah, exactly. So my point is to say, like, look, he's using, there's one permission that says, hey, if you make a vow, keep it. And there's another permission that says, but if you don't make vows, that's fine. And then a lot of Jewish ethicists, we'll say ethicists and legal thinkers, sort of also thought, yeah, just don't vow, just don't make vows. And so my point is to say, like, look, in all these examples, I mean, there's a longer argument in the book. This is like dozens of pages in the book to show that like everything that Jesus says on the sort of but I say to you side of the column is itself actually language from the Torah. So it's correlating one part of the Torah to interpret another part of the Torah.
Right. So Jesus is not nullifying Torah. He's interpreting it, and he's saying, I have a new / better way to interpret the Torah than the predominant way.
That's right.
So go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add also, and this is, I don't mean for this to be sort of, I do say it on purpose because I know it will probably get a reaction, but I don't mean it to be just like, I'm not trying to ruffle feathers with this book. But actually, I don't think there's a single thing that is unique in Jesus's instruction. And what I mean by that is almost possibly everything. And if not everything, then like 99% of all the stuff in Matthew 5 is found in other Jewish sources that say like the same thing. Jubilees says, hey, don't lust after a person with your eyes and your heart. And the point is that like you go through every example and there's just like so many Jewish texts say exactly what Jesus said. So my point is to say like, I don't think you don't have to, Jesus doesn't have to be unique here for it to be true and meaningful, right? Like just because Philo also said it doesn't like detract from the truthfulness of it, right? It's meaningful because it's true, not because it's unique, right? So anyway, sorry. That's it.
No, I think that's I think that's an important point because I think that oftentimes is the uniqueness that we think is important about Jesus is that he came up with this completely brand new thought that nobody had ever thought before. And, you actually study the scholarly sources and you're like, well, actually he's interpreting along these lines that, were predominant.
I also think it's theologically relevant. Like if we all of a sudden had that the first time we get the true moral insight is Jesus, then it actually just raises more questions than it answers. Like, well, what was God teaching his people before that? Like
was
why
God
did
involved at all? Yeah,
exactly. And so actually, I just think it's also just theologically relevant to say that. And then, as you said, sorry, I don't know if you go by Ben or Benjamin.
Ben is fine. Yeah,
Ben. Yeah, thanks. Ben. It helps then to actually place where the Gospels do emphasize his uniqueness, right?
Exactly. Right. What is he's
the uniquely begotten Son of God, right? Like that's not true of other sons of God, and stuff like that.
Yeah. Just because Philo says the same thing as Jesus doesn't mean Philo is now the Son of God, the unique, you know what I mean? Like that,
Right.
there's I like that point. I think that's actually really important. So what if, so Jesus' conflict then with the religious leaders, they're called Pharisees and scribes and all kinds of different things there in
Yep.
the New Testament text. But like if it wasn't law versus grace, or
Mhm.
legalism versus liberty, like we've been talking about, are there themes to the conflict, or is this, like
Yeah.
what is the heart of the
Yep.
conflict that keeps coming up? Like healing
Yep.
on the Sabbath is like,
Yep.
that's a no-no, and Jesus seems to do it on purpose. It's like,
Mhm.
I preached a few weeks ago on the
Luke
healing on the
13.
Sabbath, where the synagogue ruler is like, hey, there's 6 days that you
Yep.
can come and find healing. And I'm like, that's
Yep.
actually a really good point.
Yep.
Jesus,
Yep.
like, what's the big deal? Why do you got to do this on the Sabbath?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why you
Yep.
got to stir up trouble? So
I love it.
what's the heart of the contention here? Like,
Yeah.
about between the religious leaders and Jesus?
Ben, this is a great question. And I love that. This is Luke 13, 10 through 17, when he
Mhm.
heals the woman bent double.
Yes.
And I noticed that one. He doesn't just argue. I mean, you just pointed it out. So I'm just adding. He doesn't just point out, oh, it's permissible, I can do it. He says
Mhm.
it was necessary that I heal her on the Sabbath day, right?
Yes.
It's not just like I made this joke before on the podcast with Logan, where we say, like it's almost as if he saw her on a Thursday. He was like, I'll see you in a couple days. I'm gonna wait. I could have healed you now, but I'm gonna wait, because he wanted to just make
Right.
make this pop.
Yeah.
So okay, a couple things. One, I'll answer it broadly, then I'll answer, and then I'll zero in on that one. I think is a helpful example. I do think there are multiple kinds of what I call just nomistic controversy. Nomistic is just a different way of saying law-ish, Torah-ish controversy. There's one category of nomistic controversy between Jesus and the Pharisees that hinges not on like his mission or his identity as the Son of God or the Messiah or anything, but just because he has a different reading of Torah than they do. And so I think, for example, the one on, what would it be? Probably the best one is, the best one is Mark 7, but that one might take us a bit too long to get into. Luke 14, where he heals the man with dropsy, right? So this guy has an excessive amount of fluid in his body. It's sometimes some translations say dropsy, some will say edema. The point is that Jesus heals this guy, and they raise the same issue. And he says, hey, look, who of you wouldn't have, an ox or a son who falls into a well and you wouldn't get him out, right? And he asked the question in such a way to imply that, yeah, it sounds like his auditors or his audience would agree, like, yeah, we would have done that, right? So it looks like he's kind of creating an analogous situation. Like, look, if you would pull your ox or your son or whatever out of their watery plight, how am I not permitted to rescue this guy from his watery plight, right? Because he's got literally a waterlogged body, right? So he creates an analogy with the situation, and it argues for its permissibility. And it's an argument that, yeah, healing this kind of thing is permissible on the Sabbath. And that is slightly distinct from what you find in the Mishnah, or other Jewish texts that will say that, no, only heal life-threatening stuff on the Sabbath, but otherwise wait. In this case, I think Jesus just happens to disagree with that ruling and think that it's permissible, at least in this particular case, or in cases like it. And so that's just a nomistic controversy that doesn't hinge upon his identity, right? He just reads the law. And in fact, I try to show in the book that I think he's reading with the Sabbath legislation itself to come to the conclusion that he comes to. But then there are nomistic controversies in which one of the premises as to why he's doing what he's doing is because I've been commissioned for this labor and I ought to do it. So it's not just that, hey, it's permissible. It's that, like, I'm supposed to be doing this work. This is what I'm supposed to be about because God has commissioned me for this. And so if I'm not doing this, I'm not doing my job. And all of a sudden, that's a legal argument. But it's a legal argument that is, in terms of its premises, it's like a valid argument, or like, it's logical. But interlocutors might just disagree with the premise that he's commissioned. And then if you disagree with the premise that he's actually commissioned to do this labor, well, then you actually just don't think he ought to be doing that, right? So I think a good example would be the one you mentioned, healing the woman, where he says it's not just permissible, he says it was necessary. And I think the logic is because he is the herald of the executor of the restoration.
Yeah.
And the restoration is coded in some texts as a jubilee. And jubilee is a time in which the captives, people who are captives, are set free. And so this is why I think Luke 13, particularly, actually somewhat distinctively in the healing accounts, depicts this woman not just as having an ailment, but as in bondage.
Yes,
she's in bondage, and she's in need of release from that bondage.
Yes.
And so he says, look, she's a captive, but it's Jubilee time, and Jubilee time is time for liberation. So it wasn't just permissible. It was necessary that on the Sabbath, which is like a microcosm of the Jubilee, that I release her from this, right?
Yes.
Now, again, the permissibility of it, that argument stands on its own. But you would only agree that it was necessary if it's really restoration / Jubilee time, right?
Right.
And that's a premise that if you don't agree with that premise, then all of a sudden you're like, well, no, it's not. Like, it's not restoration Jubilee time, then it wasn't necessary that you do this. Another example I could give, but I won't, is the one from Matthew 12, where he argues for the permissibility of his disciples' action.
Yeah.
And he bases it on the fact that he is the commissioned Son of Man, commissioned to do this act of restoration. So then the legal argument works, but only if you agree that he's the Son of Man who's been commissioned to effect this restoration. And if you don't agree with that premise, then now you got a problem. Like, his legal arguments doesn't work, and he's transgressing and possibly leading others into transgression.
Yeah, Paul. There's so many texts that you cover in this book we don't have time to get to, and we won't try. But maybe two more things. I want to, at the end, return to, so what does this mean for the Christian in the law today?
Sure.
But before we do that, I know that some of your writing in the past has focused on the destruction of the temple, and you cover that a little bit in this book as well. Can you talk a little bit about, because you have this word restorationist eschatology.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the connection between the destruction of the temple and the end of the world, and how those, or eschatology, the end things, the last things, and how those things are connected in the logic of the synoptics?
Okay.
In 2 minutes, go.
Okay, so let's start first with temple. Is it okay if I bring the temple action into it? Because that's obviously going to be relevant. Okay. So again, if you assume that, it goes back to the what you assume the plight is. If you assume that the plight is, right, just sort of Judaism as a pattern of religion, or works righteousness, or whatever, or law stuff as just the wrong kind of religion, and of course an entailment of that would be that sacrifice is the wrong kind of religion, right? Well, then you're going to interpret Jesus's temple action as sort of his indictment of the sacrificial system itself, which is like, oh, God doesn't like this stuff, don't do this stuff anymore, I argue for, and lots of other, I mean, there's 15 different interpretations of the temple action. My particular take is that he is, again, heralding the restoration. And that in particular, Isaiah 56 says that in the time of the restoration, the temple will be a house of prayer for all nations. So importantly, what I'm trying to say is that when Jesus gets there and says, "Hey, it is said that my house will be a house of prayer for all nations," he's not quoting just sort of like, again, a pattern of religion idea. He's not just saying that, like, "Hey, this is how the temple is always supposed to be. This is how the temple is always supposed to be running." Just like, he's saying, no, in the restoration, Isaiah 56 said that this place would be a house of prayer for all nations, and it's the restoration right now. So it ought to be, but it's not, because y'all haven't repented. Y'all haven't repented from the historic transgression also, and you're not recognizing me as this agent of restoration. So you haven't repented. Therefore, instead of it being a house of prayer for all nations, it's a den of thieves, which of course quotes from Jeremiah 7, which is characterizing the people as in a state of transgression, such that the temple will be destroyed. And so that helps. I think that explains his temple action, because he knows even before he's gotten there that the people haven't repented, and so consequently they'll remain under the punitive judgment, the manifestation of which is the nations doing what the nations do, which in this case will work itself out in the destruction of the temple. And so that does a few things. One, it puts the temple action not as just sort of like a, hey, I don't like these money changers here, or I I don't like sacrifice. It's saying like he already knows before he gets to the temple that the temple is going to be destroyed as a continuation of Israel's punitive discipline. And he knows that that's going to be the case because he already knows that they haven't repented. I think Luke puts this really clearly where, like, it's in Luke 19, before he even gets to the temple, before he even does the temple action, he's already weeping over it and saying, if you'd only known the things that make for peace, but now they've been hidden from you. How often I wanted to gather you under my wings, but you weren't willing. And now you're right, temple's going to be destroyed. And then he goes straight from there to do the temple action, which shows to me like he already thinks it's going to happen before he so in other words, his temple action is not based on what he sees when he gets there. He already knows it's going to be right under judgment because of their non-repentance that he knows about prior to his arrival in Jerusalem. So that's how I connect the destruction of the temple. I think it's a continuation of the punitive discipline. How that then connects, how sort of quote the end of the world connects with particularly the restoration is that one of the events associated with the restoration in prophetic texts and in Second Temple literature is the resurrection, sort of the transformation of the world, etc. And so you see that in a microcosm, right? In Jesus, he's resurrected, and then he's enthroned, and then when he comes again, as when I think that the New Testament depicts sort of the general resurrection at the end, and the transformation of creation. I don't know if I answered your question and as to the way you phrased it, but
totally. Totally. I think often people get the impression that the destruction of the temple is God's indictment on Judaism.
Right.
And I think that in your telling of the story, there is this long-standing discipline, chastisement, that Jesus is culminating in and through his body and work.
Yep.
I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, I want to talk about us. Matt mentioned this, and I'm like really interested to hear what you have to say. But like, what about us? Like, what is our relationship to be to the law of Moses in a restorationist eschatology?
Yeah, this will, in at least in my book, this comes in most clearly in Acts 15, where the Gentiles are joining the community. The nations are joining the covenant, and all of a sudden it's a question of like, well, what do they do? All right, and so it says some of the believing Pharisees spoke up and said, well, we need to direct them to get circumcised and obey all the law of Moses. So that's one end of the response. They need to be circumcised and be directed to obey everything from the law. On the apostles get together and talk about it, read scripture, and presumably pray, and they come to an alternative conclusion. They instead say no, and then they quote an amalgamation of texts in which they quote all these prophetic texts that talk about how the nations will come in at the restoration of Israel. Like when Israel's restored, that's when the nations come in. And they're identifying this influx of believing nations as that moment. Okay, these are the believing nations that are coming in. And so then, importantly, though, I think at least, and this is a contested issue, but I try to make the argument clear in the book that they regard them as remaining Gentiles. They come in as Gentiles. And so then they still think the law sort of applies, but only laws that applied to Gentiles. And so, in other words, they do pick some laws from Leviticus 17 and 18 that are obligatory in Leviticus 17 and 18 for both the Israelite and the foreigner who resides in your midst. So, right, that's the text in Leviticus 17 and 18. It's like it singles out like nobody eat blood, whether an Israelite or the foreigner who resides in your midst. Anyone who eats blood is cut off, etc. Don't make any sacrifices away from the tabernacle, either the Israelite or the foreigner who resides in your midst, right? And so I think they apply particularly these laws, stipulations from Leviticus 17 and 18, things contaminated by idols, blood, things strangled, sexual immorality, that were obligatory in Leviticus 17 and 18 for both Israelite and the foreigner in their midst, because they're identifying this influx of nations as sort of that legal category. So I think of the council as a good foray into this question in terms of how do Gentiles relate to the law? Well, they relate to it as Gentiles. And so there's a lot from it that is just not obligatory for us. So the dietary laws, right? Leviticus 11 is explicitly identified as laws that obligate Israelites. And so that's why I think you don't have the law being, or sorry, dietary laws being imposed upon Gentiles, because they're Gentiles.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I don't know. Yes, and no. When I say I don't know, I was gonna I don't know if we have time for this, but Andrew Olera and Lamb of the
I can be
Free.
really brief. Yeah, I can
Andrew
try
Olera,
to be
Lamb of the
brief.
Free. He argues. I think he argues in that book that those 4 prescriptions seem to have relationship to major moral impurity.
Yeah,
and
they do,
so
yeah.
what they're asking Gentiles to do is to not contribute to and this is where I kind of run out of language maybe to fully be faithful to the Hebrew cosmology. But don't contribute to the pollution of creation, which is I don't know if you would agree with that, but I would love to get your take on that. And then also the fact that Paul in his ministry abrogates at least 3 of those 4 things.
Great. I'm really happy to get to the second one because I don't agree with that. But
okay. Then I would love to get your take on that too.
Okay, so yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Rolero, I don't recall. I mean, I've read Rolero, but I have to go back and read particularly that particular part. That sounds right-headed to me. That that's part of that would be part of the reasoning as to why those particular things are also singled out, is because they contribute to sort of grave moral impurity according to the Torah. Onto the second one. So I don't think Paul does mess with those. I think 1 Corinthians 8 through 10, he does have them. He does not want them to eat meat that's been. He does not want them to go to idol temples, image temples, to eat. He has so he would agree with the notion that you ought not eat things contaminated by idols, but he there's a halakhic question, a legal question as to what constitutes something that's been contaminated by an idol. Does that happen automatically, or does it happen, or is the conscience of the eater significant? And I think Paul reasons in both Romans 14, because I think Romans 14 is not about Sabbath and kashrut, but about food sacrificed images.
Yes.
And 1 Corinthians 8 through 10, that it doesn't happen automatically, the conscience of the eater. So that's why he says, look, yeah, go to the meat market and buy whatever you want. And don't ask questions, right? For conscience sake. If you're at someone's house and they tell you that this has been, this is food sacrificed images, don't eat it. And certainly don't go into an idol temple and eat. But in Romans 14, for example, if you're like, hey, if you're there are some people who are worried about eating food on a certain day because it might be a Roman pagan festival day. And so they know that, like, look, if I buy meat on this certain day, it's probably going to have been meat that's been sacrificed to an image. And so I'm just not going to eat it. And Paul's like, yeah, that's fine. If you think it's been contaminated by an idol, then
don't
for you
it
has been. Don't eat it.
Yeah.
But if there are some people's conscience who that's not what their conscience dictated. They know that, okay, I didn't walk into an idol temple and get this. I just bought it off the meat market, and I know that I'm eating it with thanksgiving to God. So Paul says that's sufficient. It's not contaminated by the image. And importantly, that is not sort of Paul's idiosyncratic thing. That is attested in Mishnah and Talmud, that like the conscience of the eater is a particularly relevant factor in food and wine that is related to image sacrifice, because right, an act of worship is in many ways, obviously it's going to be a volitional choice, right? And so, or at least that will be a component of it. There are other things that are part of it. And so if you're away from the actual domain of the image, well then, yeah. So then, so that I don't think he disagrees with that particular one. He doesn't mention the blood prohibition, but that's an argument from silence. And then he mentions sexual immorality quite a lot. So I happen to think that he's consonant with the apostolic council. And there's even some language that it looks like in one text he at least uses the same verb as the apostolic council, to apokestai porneia, in 1 Thessalonians, which is the language from the apostolic council.
Yeah. Paul, I'm so appreciative of your time with us, and I appreciate the work you're doing to help us resituate Jesus as a Jewish teacher of the law, to maybe appreciate more the continuity between Second Temple Judaism and early Christians as it relates to, I think, reclaiming all of our scriptures as
Yeah,
holy.
Yep.
But it also then gives a better picture of salvation
Mm.
that is more robust, I think, and is actually more compelling for our world.
Yeah.
Being saved from rules doesn't call me into a life like being recruited into the restoration of all things.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and so I just appreciate the good scholarship and great work you're doing. Before we go, you mentioned you're doing a podcast with Logan.
That's right. Yeah.
and it's on Jewish. It's on the law, and I'd love for you to pitch it because it's really good. It's really good.
Yeah, y'all will be surprised that it's titled Jesus and Jewish Law. Yeah, no, it's with Logan Williams. That's the title of the podcast, Jesus and Jewish Law, and it's pretty detailed and kind of goes into the minutia. So if you're like, that's you raised a lot more questions here than you answered, that would be the podcast where we probably answer a lot of those questions and 10 more you didn't ask.
Yeah.
So and that's with Logan Williams. He's a buddy and also doing a lot of good scholarship on this stuff. So
yeah, the book again is Jesus and the Law of Moses, the Gospels and the Restoration of Israel within first century Judaism. Paul, thanks so much for being our guest today.
thank you all very much.